Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second session on Plato's Gorgias. So where we got to last time was about section 476 in the Stephanus numbers, which is about 821 in our PDF. And where we got to last time was discussion between Socrates and Polus about what is achieved when somebody is punished for wrongdoing. And Polus and Socrates are kind of in agreement that paying what's due and being justly disciplined for wrongdoing is a good thing. It's admirable. And part of the reason for this is that when a person is being punished for something they've done wrong, it's kind of equivalent to undergoing treatment for some kind of ailment they've got in the body. But in this case, it's some kind of corruptional problem in the soul.
And again, it very strongly points at that care for the soul principle, isn't it? Because it flies in the face of common sense, and that's kind of what Callicles' point is going to be in a minute, isn't it?
Yeah, it's counterintuitive. So this condition, this problem that legal punishment or just punishment is trying to treat is ignorance or cowardice or injustice, which is something shameful. And so, but then we're led to ask, well, what craft is it that's going to treat the faults of the soul just as a therapist or a medical person can treat the body? So, and they conclude, and this time we're on page 823, that judges are acting as therapists of the soul. Justice gets rid of injustice and indiscipline. And it's more admirable, Socrates maintains, than some of these other professions such as medicine or financial management. So it would probably have been better not to have the problem in the first place, not to have been a wrongdoer and have had that problem in the soul. But once that's in there, or once it's occurred, next best thing is being successfully treated, as if you would if you had something that had to be cut out during surgery or something like that. And that's right at the end of page 823. So Socrates gets Polus to agree to that so while the happiest man is the one who doesn't have any problems in his soul, the next happiest is the man who gets rid of it. And Polus is quite happy with that. He says, evidently, that's right.
And this all comes at the end of him saying, like, quite a bit before this, that I'm going to show you, Polus, that you agree with this premise and that everybody does. And they finally arrive there, don't they? And that's going to come up again in this section as well. But it is a really counterintuitive thing because, like, I've got a little section here I wrote out. It says, they focus on its painfulness, but are blind to the benefit and are ignorant of how much more miserable it is to live with an unhealthy soul than with an unhealthy body. A soul that rotten with injustice, a soul that is rotten with injustice and impiety. And that was already a bit out of place there for Socrates' interlocutors. But you could imagine having this conversation in, for example, in a psychological context, and your patients or your clients are going to be like, well, no, I'm just here to treat my depression, not my attitude towards the gods, you know, which is quite interesting because it raises all sorts of questions about, well, what is it that Socrates is really getting at, and how can we think like that nowadays?
Yeah, what I was sort of wondering about that too is like sort of using the psychology analogy, and you can correct me on like the research, I'm sure, Courtney, but like it would seem, at least from my understanding, if someone's an unwilling participant in the treatment or they don't believe that it's going to work, like that's going to be a large barrier in getting them to take it on board. So it would seem like with the punishment for injustice or like something like that, if we're sort of using the psychology analogy type of thing, like it would seem to be in a similar sort of boat where for a lot of people they're going to sort of be or they're not going to view it in that way as a treatment. So that would seem it sort of undermines that point.
I think it raises a really interesting issue too about the way, again, the worldview as the kind of dominant mode of discourse kind of accounts for not participating, for example. So I remember Dan Carlin did a podcast called Hardcore History, and he did one on torture in the Middle Ages. And I think I brought it up before, but he tells this story that the people getting broken on the wheel would often participate, and they would sing out the chorus to the hymns, because in a way they were being a door was being opened up for forgiveness, so that they could enter, heaven basically through this horrible punishment. And because everyone just basically accepted that the Christian worldview was a fact, apparently, so they say, they participated more or less, in their own kind of redemption and punishment. And the same thing would happen in psychotherapy. Like Freud and the psychoanalysts talk about defensiveness or resistance in the client, So it's not like the client's not allowed to participate. It's the signs of him not participating are pathological, like pathological forms of resistance. So I just think that's where Socrates is in an interesting position, because he doesn't have the weight of doctrine, in a sense, on his side, the weight of common sense on his side, the weight of the most powerful discourse on his side. He's doing it all on his own, and he calls only his interlocutor as the witness. He disregards anybody else's opinion on the matter. So I think the dialectic is a really special technique in that regard. It strives to aim specifically at reason and truth and the kind of authenticity of that process, rather than any kind of auxiliary hypotheses that are attached to that.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I think another thing that this whole passage does is actually try and get us to think about what we imagine our own justice system is trying to achieve. Because I think as a culture, yet again, we're pretty confused about that. What is it we imagine that we're trying to achieve when somebody is punished with imprisonment, for example? So I guess there's a protection of the public rationale, but in certain violent offenders, the public has to be protected from them. That's one rationale. But as to the person themselves, ideally, it'd be achieving rehabilitation. But again, I think we're probably pretty, I'd say we're not, again, particularly good as a culture in identifying where that's feasible, where it's not feasible, and yeah, whether that is even the main objective of whatever it is we're trying to do. So yeah, these passages about justice and legally imposed punishment raise a whole heap of questions, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really cool to think of it from like that modern context about justice and rehabilitation. For some reason, my mind always goes to like the medieval times. I was just thinking how this got kind of distorted and became a really awful thing, like with the torture and the punishments of heretics, for example. And there's stories where the priesthood or whoever, the bishop would kill a whole bunch of people and basically say, well, we might kill a few good people, but that's okay. Let God sort them out, So, there was sort of you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet kind of attitude as well sometimes. So yeah, poor old Socrates was probably rolling around in his grave at sometimes in history as well.
Yeah, so if we move on to page 824, so this example of King Archelaus, the Macedonian king, comes back up again because he's kind of an exemplar. He's kind of a how not to, or on one way of looking at things, he's a how to. He's a tyrant who's put himself in power through killing people, including members of his own family. And Socrates refers back to him towards the top of page 824. And he's putting the question directly to Polus. Isn't this kind of person actually having the worst kind of life? And Polus agrees. And Socrates says that's about halfway down the page. It's because he evidently doesn't know what health and bodily excellence are like. So there Socrates is referring to someone who's avoiding treatment, back to this medical analogy. So somebody who avoids going to the doctor, and again, this isn't something that's gone away. Sometimes people do avoid going to the doctor, getting a diagnosis, partly because they don't want to undergo the treatment that they know is likely if they do get a certain diagnosis. But as Socrates points out, that's pretty childish. And in that position, somebody really is showing that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're dealing with. And so far worse than having an unhealthy body is having a soul that's rotten with injustice and impiety. And some people go to any lengths to avoid paying a penalty for that. So then towards the end of the page, again, Socrates refers back to Archelaus and the disagreement they'd had earlier, because Polus had pointed to Archelaus as someone who obviously must have been happy because he had ultimate power, and Socrates was insisting that he wasn't a happy person. He must be a miserable one. And now Polus actually agrees with him. But we're back to near the top of 825 there at section 480. We're back to the question, well, where does this leave us in relation to oratory again? This public speaking, which was, of course, the whole reason the dialogue came about, because Gorgias was going to define what it is that he actually does. And halfway down the page, Socrates sort of brings it to a head. He says, if oratory is used to defend injustice, Polus, one's own or that of one's relatives, companions or children, or that of one's country when it acts unjustly, it is of no use at all unless one takes it to be useful for the opposite purpose. And again, Socrates goes in this very counterintuitive kind of scenario, that he should accuse himself first and foremost, and then his family, and he should not keep his wrongdoing hidden but bring it out into the open. And then, if we take that train of thought to its limit, he should be his own chief accuser and use his oratory for the purpose of getting rid of the worst thing there is, injustice. And this is a bit of a bridge too far for Polus. So that's a good point to stop and welcome Ashley and welcome Thomas. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
So, hi, Ashley.
Oh, can't hear you there, Ashley.
Oh, yeah. Now?
Yep, I think
Yep,
we're good
can
now.
hear you.
It's good.
So this brings us to the point you raised in the Facebook, Ashley, about the Melian debate and how Athens was guilty of gross injustice against the people of Melos, because maybe this is exactly what Socrates is referring to here about one's own country acting unjustly.
Right, yeah.
Because
Yes,
that was
and weren't they miserable for it?
yeah, it was a great point you made about that episode in the, well, I suppose it was in the Peloponnesian War, or sort of towards the end of it. Athens acting as if it were a tyrant with the ultimate power in the Aegean region, just bullying and conquering a smaller state.
Well, I don't know if you've read that. If it was like, was it the Athens as a whole, or was it just those two particular generals who made that decision?
Well, I'm pretty sure that the generals were acting on the decisions of the assembly, but I could be wrong about that. I'm not an expert on that.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so just towards the end of page 8. Oh, sorry.
Because I guess I'm thinking, because there was that other one where didn't they send? God, it's been a few years since I read about this, but they sent another. They changed their mind and they sent another person in to come and tell. Oh no, there was another island that they attacked a few years earlier, and they sent orders to like kill them all, and then just then they changed their mind and they sent another orders from someone else to go and get there and tell them to cancel their previous orders to kill them all. And there was another island that ended up getting saved from basically the same fate, like, sort of 5 years before all that happened. But it was sort of very kind of whimsical. I think that echoes a lot to the trial of Socrates. And like, I think that was sort of part of his martyr complex, is that he knew that, like, in hindsight, people would realize that it was a stupid thing. It was a dumb thing. That it was just sort of something done on a whim, just like, killing or destroying Milos. And I think that's a bit like this like impulse for the, like, a lot of this is about appetites, I guess, in the Gorgias, so that they just kind of had this appetite for more power, a bit like, and then again in the Sicilian expedition, it was just this appetite, more power, we want our desires fulfilled, instead of being moderate and orderly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So where are we? So, okay. So we might as well go to the section towards the top of page 826, where basically Socrates keeps riffing on this idea of how somebody should act, and then Callicles can't stop himself. He has to butt in. And this is where the dialogue takes a whole new turn, because Callicles has got such strong views. And first of all, he says, "Tell me, Chaerephon, is Socrates in earnest about this, or is he joking?" And Chaerephon says, "I think he's in dead earnest about this, Callicles. Nothing like asking him, though." So Callicles confronts Socrates. "Are you in earnest, or are you joking?" And this is actually there's obviously an interesting relationship going on, I think, between Socrates and Callicles. They've obviously had some dealings in the past. And Socrates tries to make a common ground with Callicles. He says they're both lovers, Socrates of Alcibiades, Clinias' son, and a philosophy. And Callicles is a lover of the demos, that's the people of Athens, and a young man called Demos, who's the son of Pyrilampes. And he makes a very interesting observation about somebody who's trying to please the people. Somebody who's trying to please the people, the demos, is going to say things that they think the people want to hear, whether or not that's consistent with what they actually think or what they said another time. So there's some kind of radical inconsistency, Socrates is saying, where somebody can't actually tell their loved ones the truth. But philosophy is his love, that's Socrates' love, and she always tells the truth. And so, in fact, Socrates gives quite a big speech here, and Callicles picks him up on it and says, "Socrates, I think you're grandstanding in these speeches, acting like a true crowd pleaser." Again, we come back to this idea of what's oratory. It's persuasion, it's influencing. What's Socrates trying to do? He's trying to establish his credentials as an authority.
Yeah. How do you pronounce that name again?
Which one?
Because there's the one that starts C. Callicles?
Callicles.
Callicles. Okay. Yeah, because I was looking at that, I had no idea. Yeah, I found Callicles kind of annoying. There was like it's further down, but there was like one point I was like, oh my God, this is just frustrating to read. Uh, um, yeah, but this point on the when he's saying that uh, like sort of the I guess like democratic idea. I don't know whether this is like a problem because it's it seems it's good. Like you want the representatives to alter their view to what the people want, like in the sense that they're a servant. Like in the same way that you have like a public servant will sort of just do what they're told, like the police, fire, um, administrative tasks, like they're just going to go off and do it. And like there is something about that where it seems like that's a feature, not a bug, within that type of role.
But
It probably does still the character of the person does still matter, like in terms of the politician, given the power they wield. But at this point, doesn't seem like I don't know. Yeah, to me, it just seems like sort of just staying the feature of it.
so you would want our politicians to be like that, but they're not supposed to have a representative democracy. It's supposed to be a direct democracy.
Yeah, I'm not sure that distinction really makes much difference. But I think you're right, Shannon. I think what maybe Socrates is pointing indirectly to here is some of the issues around democracy. You know, was it Winston Churchill who said, you know, the greatest argument against democracy is 5 minutes with the average voter? Basically, the being the will of the people or carrying out the will of the people is both a feature and a bug, because often, what do the people want? Often they do just want the gratification. You know, they want the extra rail line there, or the new hospital here, or they want the extra childcare centre, or whether or not those are actually justified by the common good or not. So, yeah, it's a fine line between what a politician's going to do. Are they going to, and you know, we see it today when a politician is condemned as, oh, he's just following what the focus groups think. Well, yeah, but maybe that's what he should be doing, you know. So, yeah, I don't think there's an answer to that. I think it's one of the features and bugs of democracy.
Yeah, and I'd be interested about this too, like because given that their structure of democracy was so much smaller in terms of how many voters you had, I don't know whether this is the case, but it would seem like you could almost it's like corruption of it would seem a lot easier. Like it's when you have only I don't know, this is what I imagine in my head, but if you have only like 2,000 voters, it's a lot easier to corrupt the system compared to like when you have 2 million. Like it's a lot harder to buy people off directly. But yeah, and that's where like I guess it's sort of it's almost like a way of escaping that critique of that I threw on the end of that the character of the politician still matters, so that I have this little escape hole to go, oh well, you know, at the end of the day, it still does matter about the character. But yeah, no, it is. I do see what you're saying. That like it is definitely a challenge. I like this is a side story, but like I was reading about like the history of statistics, and there was a vote within I think it was like Milan or like one of the Italian cities, and one of the people thought it was corrupted, and so he spent about 10-15 years developing a new system of statistics just to show that the vote had been corrupted. It's quite petty and also impressive. I can't remember what it was. I think it was something to do with Bayesianism, or like the pre-Bayes. But yeah, that's an aside point.
Well, actually, and I'm going to do another little aside point, but it's kind of related, as you'll see in a moment. So there's a story that every student of ancient history knows, and you may well have heard it, that, and it must have been the generation before Pericles, I suppose, I'm thinking, or maybe around the same time. Anyway, the Athenian democracy had this system called ostracism. So where if enough people put somebody's name scratched on a piece of pot, an ostracon, they would be exiled, they would be banished from the city. And at one stage, the politician was called Aristides, and he was known as a man of absolute integrity, and so his nickname was Aristides the Just. He somehow or other found himself being at risk of being ostracized, and the Athenians are all scratching on their ostraca, and some guy comes up to him and says, "Can you help me fill out my ostracon?" And he says, who do you want to exile? He says, "Oh, Aristides, I'm just sick of hearing him called the Just." And when I heard this story when I was in high school, I didn't understand what a devastating critique of democracy it is. But that's what it is. That's what you get in democracy. You get people sick and tired of hearing somebody who's actually a person of great integrity. They're just sick of hearing his name, so they just want to get rid of it. That's democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. That story made me think of like a modern example of this is like Brexit, where I think for a lot of people, like, and it's also this thing of the lines of where democracy is, of like, well, what subjects should be democratic and what ones do we like defer to representatives. Not that I have like any skin in the game, but my general vibe of it is it's not something that should have gone to the vote. Like these sort of large scale sort of things should be just decided by representatives rather than the Rex vote. Now, people can obviously disagree one way or the other on that, but I think it's a like modern example of where there are like a lot of people who view that as like, no, this issue should just be dealt by representatives. So it's sort of indirectly like there is some democratic element to it, but it's like it's sort of cut off. And so like where those lines are of like what's cut off from a democratic vote versus like where you can sort of have the random sways and moments of people where, at least from my perspective, it seems like a lot of people were swayed on that with like misrepresentative advertising of creating this idea there's all this money disappearing. Though, again, didn't have any skin in the game, so I haven't paid that much attention to it. But like, yeah, there definitely seems there are at least some issues that shouldn't be democratic.
There's also, this idea, I feel like anyway, that there's a kind of relativism there, because he's saying if you love the people, I think he uses the term in English at least, that you're unable to contradict your beloved. So he says you keep shifting back and forth, which made me think of the Stoic formulation, because they talk about oscillation. So they've internalized it more to a psychological state of moving back and forward between propositions. But in this case, you're moving back and forward between the opinions of the people and trying to come up with what's going to work out best for you, And he's really saying that luckily for him, he doesn't only just love people, because he says he loves Alcibiades, he also loves philosophy, and philosophy is constant and not fickle. And so as a result, he can be impartial, and that means he doesn't have to bend the law and he doesn't have to break the rules. And that saves him, I guess, from a certain kind of subjectivism, at least, right? He's got universal principles and standards which protects him against favoritism and popularism and things like that. So I think that's an interesting point.
I'm not sure how much that protects it though, because I like sort of before, I like watching debates and this sort of thing, and a lot of them around like religion and that sort of thing. And so there'll be these like Christians with like really, really narrow, strong views of what it means to be a Christian, and like most people who claim to be Christians aren't actually Christians. And they'll be like, what the problem is with the society today? We don't have enough Christians. And they mean like their very particular thing of what they believe. So it seems like you can kind of have this, like, the subjectivity seems like to get smuggled in on the way, where you go, oh, like this is what the philosophy actually is. But
But
then
the
that's
problem,
gonna be,
but obviously the problem with the Christian is they have a dogma, and a faith, whereas, and it's the interpretation of the faith, the exegesis, I think the terms they use. But Socrates isn't talking about that. He's talking about everybody has a fair share in reason, and if we engage that, we ought to be able to work it out through a fair and impartial conversation about what the truth is.
oh yeah, but these type of Christians are like they're not a faith-based type of Christian. They're like it's a reasoned, or they view it as a reasoned position, or at least that's what they would say.
Yeah,
So their point would
claims
be
to be dogmatic, do they? No, nobody says I'm really dogmatic about this.
Yeah,
they all
exactly.
say I'm guided by reason.
Yeah, that would absolutely agree with you on all those points, Courtney. They'll be like, yes, and I have reasoned this out. All of you know that Jesus Christ died for our sins, and you're just oppressing the truth.
Yeah.
So, and like Jude just said, like we all believe we're driven by reason. Well, most people believe it.
All right, let's move on. Let's see what
Hey,
Callicles
so
has
how
to say.
come? I was just wondering, like, because shouldn't that be that Socrates says, "My loves is Alcibiades and philosophies, and yours is rhetoric and demos"?
Well, it's the demos that's the people of Athens, because apparently Callicles is a bit of a people pleaser, a bit of a populist, as well as this young guy called Demos, whom we never meet otherwise. That's just a bit of a wordplay that just happened to be there, I think.
Right. So that goes to imply Callicles' opinion is the opinion of the many.
Pretty much, yeah. Whatever they want at a certain time, which is obviously going to shift around because they're not consistent.
Because I'm just saying, like, because Socrates says, oh, he loves Athens so much that he would never exile is worse than death. In that sort of like you wouldn't get that from the Gorgias,
Yes and no. That's probably a bigger question. We'll be in a better position to answer once we get to the end, I would say.
Because in this it seems like, yeah, he's just interested in the truth. He's correct me if I'm wrong, all this kind of thing. Because in the Crito, his arguments definitely don't stack up. But yeah, that all he cares about is the truth, and if people aren't truthful in Athens, he doesn't care if he's the only one person that's right and everyone else is wrong. Like it seems kind of odd why he would want to live in a city of untruthful people. And then in this passage, he doesn't say that he has a love for Athens, but this other guy loves the demos. I have two loves. Yours is the demos. Mine's not. It's the truth.
Yeah, so Callicles then gives quite a big speech of his own. And he has a bit of a go at, at Polus and Gorgias because essentially they weren't brave enough, in Callicles' opinion, to say what they thought. Because Callicles insists that really people do think that basically might is right. But also along the way, he has a bit of a swipe at Socrates trying to trick people and get them to contradict themselves. And he makes an appeal to nature. He says towards the end of this page, which is page 827, while Polus meant that, that's just what's happened here on the question of doing what's unjust versus suffering it. While Polus meant that doing it is more shameful by law, you, that's Socrates, pursued the argument as though he meant by nature. For by nature, all that is worse is also more shameful, like suffering what's unjust, whereas by law, doing it is more shameful. No man would put up with suffering what's unjust, only a slave would do so, one who is better dead than alive, who, when he's treated unjustly and abused, can't protect himself or anyone else he cares about. I believe that the people who institute our laws are the weak and the many, which is interesting considering that that's actually the demos, the people that he flatters and tries to please. So they institute laws and assign praise or blame with themselves and their own advantage in mind. As a way of frightening the more powerful among men, the ones who are capable of having a greater share and of getting a greater share than they say that getting more than one share is shameful and unjust, and that doing what's unjust is nothing but trying to get more than one share. I think they like getting an equal share since they are inferior. And so he makes this appeal to nature.
And
So
this seems to be...
Yeah, so
sorry,
I was just going to ask what we think about this argument of Callicles.
I think it's interesting because I used to be a bit of a fan of Nietzsche, and if you think about Nietzsche's critique of Socrates, he's obviously taking Callicles' side in a way. He's saying along, and he's doing what the weak intellectuals do, and they've created this abstract metaphysics, but nature would have the strong and the rare kind of superior individual just come out and break the chains of society, and actually society should be there to serve the needs of genius and allow and you know, they're just there to clean up the mess while genius kind of makes leaps and bounds and creates civilization, basically. And it's the kind of thing that Callicles is really arguing for. So you can see the influence on Nietzsche, I think, anyway.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Courtney. And I did actually look into this some time ago.
I hadn't thought of that, but
oh, sorry. Was that
in regards to that, like it does, at least even if not like directly Nietzsche, like it's Nietzsche-esque.
Yeah,
it's very Nietzsche-y. Like he says here, surely powerful men will rise who will shake off and tear apart and escape all this. He will trample underfoot our documents, our tricks and charms, and all our laws that the many, and they institute laws, and they create feelings of, almost like Nietzsche would call it, ressentiment, you know, shame and guilt in the powerful people, so that they will give over their fair share to the majority who are much weaker, and the weak people want to attack the superior man because they're jealous, basically. This is the argument. And so he says so they basically praise their own selves, their own, you know, humility, for example, and things like that. Their own fairness, their own ability to obey the laws and feel shameful, for example, which is exactly what Socrates is advocating for.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Also, I was just going to say, I did look into this a little while ago, and in fact, when we were doing Ecce Homo last year, I think, and it was only quite recently, and maybe in the 90s, where somebody actually looked at this question of whether Nietzsche had been explicitly influenced by Callicles or not. It's like, really? It had to wait till the 90s, after 100 years? And that seemed really weird to me, you know, because it seems obvious that there's an influence there. But Nietzsche didn't actually acknowledge any influence in Callicles, apparently. But for anyone who's read both of them, it's like the likeness is unmistakable.
Yeah, well, so it sounds like Courtney's in good company in his assessment.
That's right.
What I think interesting, I was just thinking of this, well, Courtney, while you're going through it, is like how much this connects to, like, maybe not all, but like a fair chunk of different, like vastly different political positions. Like you could have like your like communists or anarchists being like, well, like the worker's the one that's doing the work, so they should be the one that's getting the reward. Like they're actually the capable person here. You can have like the libertarian or anarcho-capitalist who's like, oh, it's the capitalist, it's the money that's the capable men, so they should be getting the greater share. You could have like things like the like JQ, like Jewish conspiracy stuff, which is like, oh, the Jewish people are in control of everything, and they're actually undermining who should be getting the greater share. Yeah, I think it's interesting, like how many. I wouldn't say it's all positions, but like, yeah, that it can apply. It seems like it could apply to many political positions. It's just the framing of who is actually the one that's viewed as doing the work.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, Shannon. I think that kind of reflects that Nietzsche has been pressed into the service of people all along the political spectrum, essentially. But you're right. I mean, and also, I think some of those political positions that you've identified also suffer from exactly the same problems that Socrates is quickly going to identify in Callicles' position. So what does he mean by the stronger and the weaker? What does he mean by the better and the worse? What does he mean by the people who should be in power? I think what's interesting, just towards the second half of page 828 there, when Callicles appeals to Pindar, one of the poets, Law, the king of all, of mortals and the immortal gods, this, he says, brings on and renders just what is most violent with towering hand. I take as proof of this the deeds of Heracles, for he unbought. His words are something like that. I don't know the song well. He says that Heracles drove off Geryon's cattle, even though he hadn't paid for them, and Geryon hadn't given to him, on the grounds that this is what's just by nature, and that cattle and all the other possessions of those who are worse and inferior belong to the one who's better and superior. Now, this is quite an interesting little segment, because why is Callicles quoting this poetry that he says himself he doesn't know well? I think Plato is telling us that Callicles is cherry picking from the classics, cherry picking something to support his position. So Heracles kidnapped the cattle belonging to this monster called Geryon, and he had some clever trick to make it look as though the cattle had gone one way when he'd taken them another way. And Heracles is obviously a hero. You know, he's half immortal, so he's better or stronger in that sense than most people. So that's why he's using Heracles as an example. And so then Callicles kind of shifts tack and attacks Socrates and his persistence in pursuing philosophy as a grown man. He says that's quite inappropriate. It's okay when you're younger. And then he says such people, the ones who pursue philosophy in their older years, turn out to be inexperienced in the laws of their city or in the kind of speech one must use to deal with people on matters of business, whether in public or private, inexperienced also in human pleasures and appetites, and in short, inexperienced in the ways of human beings altogether. So he's turning around and saying Socrates and anyone like him who goes in for philosophy in their mature years is just a write-off when it comes to anything practical or relevant in politics.
And that's the section where he says you wouldn't even be able to defend yourself in a court and all that sort of stuff. Is that the bit you're talking about? Because he says you'd be slack-jawed and you wouldn't know what to do, or is that a bit later on?
I think that's a bit later on, maybe. Not quite sure.
Oh.
But yeah, it's and he really hammers home this point. You know, he says, just as he likes hearing children speak in the way that children speak, but if you hear an adult speaking that way, it's ridiculous. And interestingly, and it comes up here and it comes up again later on, Callicles is, again, a little bit like Nietzsche, is quite comfortable with talking about violence against people. He says, when one hears a man speaking haltingly or sees him playing like a child, it strikes me as ridiculous and unmanly, deserving of a flogging. And he says it again a little bit later on. When I see an older man still engaging in philosophy and not giving it up, I think such a man by this time needs a flogging. So he's not averse to talking about physical violence against people who pursue a different form of life.
And you know, following the Nietzsche thing again, because I was thinking about this, Callicles tends to have this perspective, and I think he quotes Homer, and he says the poet, and the footnote says Homer, believes that a man comes to preeminence in the marketplace and in the city, and that people like Socrates are just sitting around whispering in the corner with their boys or whatever. So they're not really participating. But the irony in Nietzsche's Zarathustra Zarathustra is that he goes and spends 10 years living in a cave, which I thought was interesting because he's got this philosophy like Callicles, but he can't really fit in. He comes to it not from actually participating with people, but somehow being alone in nature. It's kind of an inversion of it. It's pretty strange. I'd like to explore it further. We'll have to read Thus Spake Zarathustra again soon. I know you've read.
But maybe you're pointing to one of the kind of the sort of the contradictions in this position. On the one hand, yeah, Callicles is saying, oh, well, you're just impractical, you're not pragmatic, you're not involved, you're not productive in the polis. But at the same time, he's kind of gesturing to people who are separated, who are away from, like King Archelaus, he's not involved with everyone else. He's out there. He's kind of a Superman on his own. So yeah, there is this tension, I think, between what kind of man it is that Callicles is saying is the right kind of man.
Because even the great artist, right, can be a genius in that Nietzschean sense, but he's completely impractical. So Callicles is talking about someone very specific too. He has to be a persuader of men. And obviously it comes back to persuasion again as this superpower, this special gift or special power.
Yeah. And so I thought this was near the top of page 830. Callicles makes a point of saying he's got a soft spot for Socrates, which is quite interesting. He's kind of trying to not come from a position of antipathy in that sense, but saying that he's well disposed towards him. And so, yes, this is a section you referred to, Courtney, where he says that if Socrates was ever unjustly put on trial, and of course we know that's going to happen, he's going to be helpless and he's not going to know how to defend himself. And of course, we do know how eventually Socrates did defend himself. But again, Callicles invokes violence. He says, such a man one could knock on the jaw without paying what's due for it, to put it rather crudely. And then Socrates makes an interesting sort of approach in response to this long speech of Callicles, where Callicles has basically tried to discredit everything Socrates has said. And Socrates says he's come into a piece of good luck because he knows that Callicles is going to be honest about what he thinks of him. And he says that Callicles has three good qualities: knowledge, goodwill, and frankness. And the Greek for that is parousia, the frankness, openness of speech. And he runs into a lot of people who aren't very honest about him. But and this is on page 831, he's actually heard Callicles talking with his friends and saying much the same thing. So he knows that Callicles is being honest with him, and that's what he wants.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. I made a note of that too, because he's actually saying the kind of person who puts a soul to a good test is someone with knowledge, goodwill, and frankness. So he actually made this really interesting comment just prior to that, Judith, where he says, if my soul was made of gold, I'd like to find the kind of stone that I could test my soul on. And he uses the word cared for, to find out if my soul had been well cared for. It says cared for again, as opposed to some other metaphor like well shaped or something like that, which is a more Foucauldian one. And then he says that about, this is a great opportunity for me because right now I'm getting tested by you, and you're the kind of person who has the right qualities to test me because you have knowledge, goodwill, and frankness. But you could take this whole section here too about Socrates' willingness to go through hardship when the situation is a superb test of his character, in a sense where he gets to hammer out his golden soul out on the anvil of the truth kind of thing, which will be later on become a kind of very stoic kind of principle as well.
I was wondering as well, would any of you know like the frankness component there? Like, is there like a particular Greek word that's referencing, or like is that a pretty reasonable translation of it? Because it sort of seems like the first two, I'm like, oh yeah, I get that, and then frankness is like, oh, it's an odd choice of word, but maybe that's also my modernity because it sounds very like it's very like casual, I guess,
Yeah, I'm
to
pretty
say someone
sure.
has frankness.
I'm pretty sure the word is parrhesia, which became a thing for the Stoics as well.
So then you'd think it'd be bluntness or a plain way of speaking about the truth or something.
Yeah, or
Yeah, so
like
it's, oh, sorry, I've got it here. Yeah, it's epistemen te kai eunoian by parrhesian. So knowledge, goodwill, and freedom of speech. Yeah, so that's what it is.
okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So at the bottom of that page, which is 831, Socrates wants Callicles to restate his position. What is it that you hold is just by nature? And of course, that's the key question. You know, what is it that is just according to nature? And again, that's obviously going to be a big thing for the Stoics as well. That the superior should take by force what belongs to the inferior, that the better should rule the worse, and the more worthy have a greater share than the less worthy. You're not saying anything else, are you? I do remember correctly. Yes, that's what I was saying, says Callicles, and I still say so now. So then Socrates, and this takes some time, tries to get to the bottom of what this stronger, better kind of definition is. And it's not quite as straightforward as Callicles seems to think at first. Even though he says, I'm telling you clearly, they're the same. A better and strong, superior, better and stronger, the same.
I love these sort of sequences, though. They kind of make me laugh because you try and do it in real life and it never goes like it. But, you know, it's so formulaic in the dialogues. Like he basically just says something like, the many are superior to one, right? And the guy's like, right. So the rules of the many are the rules of the superior, right? Right. Oh, the rule of the many is to have an equal share in that doing what's unjust is more shameful than suffering it. Right? Right. It's as simple as that. So good.
It got me like there was a paper I was reading that was talking like about philosophy, and one of the points they made in it was you never want to let a philosopher get going. Like you don't want to make that agreement. You always want to be like, wait, like what do you mean by that term? Like just stop them in the tracks to like keep them honest. Because like once you get this agreement going, it's like they're like getting the snare ready for you, like putting it around your neck, and they're just ready to yank it. At this part, like just because of reading that, I was like, oh, yeah, I see. Like Socrates is sitting there, like rolling up the rope, getting it ready, and then like Cassilis, I'm not going to say his name, but and then it's like he's like going, oh wait, no, I don't actually mean them the same. Like further down, they're the different things here, and it's sort of all over the place. It's
yeah.
Quite.
So I think I actually found this was a really good point, you know, because Socrates here appeals to what most people think, right? Because do the many observe or do they not observe the rule that it's just to have an equal and not a greater share, and that doing what's unjust is more shameful than suffering it? And so it's an appeal to popular opinion. You know, is this what most people think, or isn't it? And Callicles agrees, yep, that's what most people think. So it's not only by law. So it's not just the laws. It's actually what people, as a general rule, think. So it might not be exactly nature, but it's certainly not just law. So it looks as though Socrates says, you weren't saying what's true earlier and weren't right to accuse me when you said that nature and law were opposed to each other. And Callicles isn't very happy about Socrates' method. Haven't I been telling you all along that by better and superior, I mean the same thing? Or do you suppose that I'm saying that as a rubbish heap of slaves and motley men, worthless except perhaps in physical strength, gets together and makes any statements and these are the rules? Okay, so Callicles doesn't mean maybe manual workers, people who are physically stronger. That's not what he means by the better or the superior, even though they're actually stronger. Iskouterous in Greek. And so Socrates, yeah, he was ahead of him. I guess some time ago that it's some such thing you mean by superior. And but I think, as I said earlier, I think the Nietzsche position, or if we understand the Nietzsche position to be cognate to Callicles, I think that also suffers from some of these same problems that Callicles' position does. Who are the great men for Socrates, the great man or the great men for Socrates, for Nietzsche rather? It's obviously not manual workers. Is it intellectuals? Well, he had contempt for most intellectuals. It obviously wasn't going to be any women. It wasn't going to be. So we have sort of these diminishing classes of superior people, maybe diminishing down to one.
It's like he has this, he's even crazier than Callicles, really, because he has almost the opposite of the Stoics with their sage. He's got the Übermensch, right? So it's this rare individual of a special worth who's allowed to break all the rules because he's a genius. But it does smack of class, and it especially does in Callicles, because like he says, why are you always talking about cooks and cleaners and farmers? Who gives a fuck about them, basically? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the superior men. You know what I'm talking about, So, and that's interesting because I think people still talk like that. When we're talking about great men, we're not talking about the cleaner down at the supermarket or the guy who drives the Uber. And I've always thought that weird that, like a movie star can make $1 million, whereas a guy who invents a cure to cancer might live his life kind of relatively unknown, which I think is peculiar. But I was going to say, of course, the Stoics really pick up on this theme, don't they? Because they're very much interested in the ordinary man. You could be a farmer. I think Musonius Rufus, right? He kind of says it's a good life for a philosopher, kind of working the land and being close to nature and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see this a little bit later on where Socrates deliberately stirs up Callicles by referring to people like cobblers and, other low kinds of people. So Socrates gives the kind of a thought experiment towards the end of that page. Hold it right there. What can your meaning be this time? Suppose we were assembled together in great numbers in the same place as we are now, and we held in common a great supply of food and drink. And suppose we were a motley group, some strong, some weak, but one of us, being a doctor, was more intelligent about these things. He would very likely be stronger than some and weaker than others. Now, this man, being more intelligent than we are, will certainly be better and superior in these matters. Callicles says, yes, he will. Socrates says, so should he have a share of this food greater than ours because he's better? Or should he be the one to distribute everything because he's in charge, but not to get a greater share to consume and use up in his own body if he's to escape being punished for it? And that's a very good distinction, I think, that Socrates makes right there. Are you talking about these superior people having more for themselves or just making the rules for everybody else? What is it actually you're talking about? And again, of course, Callicles is a bit irritated by that. You keep talking of food and drink and doctors and such nonsense. That's not what I mean. Don't you mean that the more intelligent one is the better one? Say yes or no. Yes, I do. But not that the better should have a greater share. Not food or drink anyhow. Not clothes either. Not the most beautiful clothes either at that. And of course, there's a cobbler. Socrates always brings in a cobbler. Perhaps the cobbler should walk around with the largest and greatest number of shoes on. And of course, Socrates himself, we know from the Symposium, tended to go around barefoot anyway, so it didn't matter to him. And again, Callicles gets annoyed. Take a farmer, a man intelligent and admirable and good about land. Perhaps he should have the greatest share of seed and use the largest possible quantity on his own land. How you keep saying the same thing, Socrates. So, yeah, Callicles doesn't mean cobblers or cooks, but those who are intelligent about the affairs of the city, about the way it's to be well managed, and not only intelligent, but also brave, competent to accomplish whatever they have in mind without slackening off because of softness of spirit. So this is really interesting. Callicles appeals to virtue. He appeals to courage in particular, without actually sort of recommending or adhering to virtue principles himself.
But in the background too, he's clearly referring to people who have the free time and the education and things like that, and the connections to be involved in political life. The problem with the cobbler and the farmer is that they're busy tending their flocks or fixing up shoes. So yeah, it's interesting from a class point of view.
Absolutely, and I will point out too here that I don't think it comes up in this dialogue, but it certainly comes up in the Theaetetus. Socrates' father was a stonemason and his mother was a midwife, a professional midwife. And that's where Socrates gets his image of himself as being a midwife of people's ideas. It's even a lower rent profession in a sense than the cobblers and the farmers, because it's a female profession. Socrates takes on himself that role, which is of it's even beyond the ken of a Callicles. Is God forbid Socrates should mention midwives. But he regarded himself as a midwife. So yeah, he identified with that most.
Well, Judith, it's not as low as a gadfly.
True. At least it's human.
Yeah.
What I found funny, I was just thinking about this. Like, today I was listening to this a Muslim, like talking about Muhammad and how like following Islam is like it's so practical, has all these good outcomes, and then the person talking to him was like, "Oh, okay, so like, what real world like what do you mean by will make my life better?" Oh, well, like I don't mean materially. I mean, it's going to have all these other like spiritual things because Muhammad's the best. And it sort of fell into this same, like the dialogue was actually really similar to what's going on here with Socrates, where it was like, okay, but what are you actually meaning by better? Like, how is my life actually going to improve if I convert to Islam? Yeah, it's just funny seeing it like in a modern context reappearing.
Well, that's
Yeah,
right.
and I mean,
Yeah, I was
also
just going to say, sorry, Courtney, I was just going to say, it does depend what you mean by better. I mean, it seems simple, but it's actually a lot more complex than you might think.
Yeah, and I'm just drawing on another modern example because it's in the same vein of what we're talking about. Influencers like people who've been on Big Brother and stuff like that, the whole Instagram crowd. Well, it's a bit like Callicles is one of these cryptocurrency bosses, and he's like, he's not talking about the tradesman who fixes your toilet when the toilet's broken. And it's like Socrates is that kind of working class guy. And he's like, what are you talking about, bro? Like, I'm a person who lives in this city too. And Callicles is kind of going, no, not you, Socrates. I mean, there are other people, those other ones. But you and me, we know all about crypto and Ethereum, and we're going to shoot for the moon and drive our Lambos to Thailand next full moon, right? It's that kind of vibe, I think.
You've definitely been listening to Crypto Bros when that's
I know what you're talking about, not because I watch Crypto Bros, but because I watch videos of like the warning new scam, do not fall for this fake crypto, which is not really a crypto kind of videos.
Okay, let's move on because there's a really important section just coming up here. So it's the top of page 835. And Socrates takes advantage of Callicles bringing up this idea of rulers and ruled to suggest that, well, maybe there's a need for each person to rule himself as well as or instead of others. And Callicles says, what do you mean rule himself? Obviously a new idea, or at least one he's not willing to entertain. But Socrates says nothing very subtle, just what the many mean. Yeah, again, he's appealing to what common sense wisdom is here. Being self-controlled and master of oneself, ruling the pleasures and appetites within oneself. How delightful you are, says Callicles. By the self-control, you mean the stupid ones. And so then Callicles takes the opportunity to launch into another big speech. So he says that the man who lived correctly ought to allow his own appetites to get as large as possible and not restrain them. And when they're as large as possible, he ought to be competent to devote himself to them by virtue of his bravery and intelligence. Again, he appeals to these quasi-virtues and to fill them with whatever he may have an appetite for at the time. But that isn't possible for most people because they lack the ability to provide for themselves fulfillment for their pleasures. And so they use this sort of incompetence as an excuse and praise self-control and justice. But people who are in a position of power, such as tyrants or rulers, they shouldn't be exercising self-control, and they should be just helping their friends, getting rid of their enemies, and pursuing their desires as much as possible. So what do we think about this frank avowal by Callicles?
Now Courtney's pointed it out, like it's just so Nietzschean. Like this whole when he's talking about the man who lived correctly ought to allow his own appetites to get large possible, not restrain them. Oh, but he'll also have the virtue to being control. Like it just there is like definitely something there, like that thread running through to Nietzsche. Which yeah, like so you said it was the 90s that
I think it was. I'll check that and post it on the Facebook, but it was quite recent.
Yeah,
it was just astonishingly recent.
Yeah, it's so surprising because like you're not talking about like neither of them are obscure people like Plato and Nietzsche. I guess like Nietzsche though, to be fair to him, like at least from my understanding, like he had a resurgence in like the 50s or the 60s. So then you have like 40 years for them to notice that. Still feels that long though. Like just because it is Plato.
Yeah, I know it's hardly an obscure text, right? So it's just bizarre. I can only assume that a lot of people who've specialized in Nietzsche haven't specialized in Plato. I can only assume, but that again seems counterintuitive, so I don't quite understand. Or maybe it's so obvious that nobody's thought to document it before. That's the other possibility.
That's true as well, yeah. Like it could always be just like it's not like ideas don't have copyright. Like it could just be that they just happen to end up sounding similar, and then we're sort of reading back into it. This sort of Nietzsche, but it does like it's just so close. Yeah.
And I guess the thing to here, it's really important to me at least to notice that what he's saying is you got to get your appetites as large as possible, and not restrain them. And when they're as big as possible, it's not about controlling them at all. It's about making sure that you're in that kind of position of strength and power and have enough cunning and bravery and intelligence to always be able to satisfy and maintain them. So no one's talking about curbing or moderating or getting it just right. It's you have those intellectual qualities or that power to put pressure on other people to keep feeding that vast kind of demand that your appetites have developed. And for him, he's saying that's good. That's really good. That's a mark of the truly powerful or good man, the great man.
And just one other point, just like this is which hopefully I'm not skipping too far ahead, but just right at the end of that page of 835, where he's got as for these other things, these fancy phrases, these contracts of men that go against nature, they're worthless nonsense. I've been thinking about this recently, like around the whole idea of what is actually meant by nature, like, or like by extension, like what does it mean to be a naturalist? And like I find it a very slippery term of like it almost feels to me like which maybe this is an odd position, and maybe it's because of my lack of religious upbringing. But like when I think of like gods or God, like I just assume them, like I can't help but just assume them as part of nature. Like I find it hard to draw these sharp lines of like, oh, okay, like I would obviously accept this as natural and that is the supernatural. Like if the world worked differently, I'll just go, oh, okay, like that's just how the world works. But yeah, and it is interesting as well, like that this like rhetorical attack that it goes against nature is like, you know, it's still with us to this day. It's sort of a classic. So yeah, so it's good to see that we're drawing on Titans when we use it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it actually occurred to me when reading this that we're seeing a slightly different form now in some cases, and you'd have seen this online as well, Shannon. The Evo bros, you know, the evolutionary, the people who will justify, you know, I don't know, wanting to have sex with multiple partners or whatever it is. Oh, but we're just programmed that way by nature. Okay, well, maybe. But yeah, it just takes a slightly different form now when it comes to those justifications, you know. So yes, I guess for us, nature implies something evolutionary nowadays, whereas it didn't obviously for people in Plato's time. So yeah, it's certainly a very interesting idea as to what nature does actually imply or entail.
Yeah, and it's so frustrating how common that type of argument is. Like it's such a bad argument. And it also does feel kind of like, well, okay, like if you're saying like, oh, like this is the way we've evolved and like this is within our nature, and it's like, well, like we're going to like it's to me, it just in some ways I can interpret that as saying we're going to do what we're going to do. Like it's like, okay, like yeah, no, I agree. I am going to do what I'm going to do. My nature is what my nature is, and I'm going to follow my nature. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It just doesn't seem like anything's being said, but it's like, yeah. Oh no, this is such a deep meaning, and that's why women are subpar creatures and beneath us, and we need to abolish the female vote.
Yeah, I know. It either collapses into a kind of uninformative little circle there, or it makes a completely implausible claim about what is appropriate.
But I think that's what makes Plato's philosophy and the Stoics actually really neat, is that they pick the right thing, you know, that is distinctly human, and they pick reason. And so that, you know, like the Stoics will often say, the last thing a man wants to become is an animal, which implies the same sort of thing that the behaviorists talk about. They try to describe modern human behavior in terms of stimulus and response, as if we were like animals. But the Greeks were already well aware of the fact that we're trying to do the opposite of that. We're trying to activate reason and reflect on our situation and contemplate, you know, what would be the better way to do this or live this life, and what's best for us and other people. Like, you know what I mean? So from an evolutionary point of view, if you are inclined like these guys, these ancient philosophers, to focus on reason, it leads in a much more stimulating and interesting direction than, say, just pure biological genetics, which could be blind, you know, it could go in any direction, basically, to suit any argument.
That just sounds like a beta male talking point, and you just need to sleep with more bitches.
Well, I had a funny one the other day, and I don't want to be controversial, but somebody said to me, and I really don't want to be controversial, I'm sure this is a perfectly fine point, but they have a child who is having some problems at school because they have neurological diversity, they call it, you know, some form of autism, for example. And they were saying, well, they'd heard this evolutionary theory and they were quite cranky with the school. And they were saying, in my opinion, and based on this evolutionary theory, I think they were trying to get at, it's the new phase of evolution, and her children are just a kind of obvious case of this, that the neurotypical people are of a prior kind of evolutionary phase, and these new kids who are autistic and the like. I'm trying not to be controversial. Man, I'm gonna get into trouble. But you know what I mean? Like, and it maybe, possibly, maybe we're evolving into aliens. I don't know. But to me, it's not the argument to pick, right? I think the Greeks were on the right track when they decided to focus on reason and how it seems to be able to guide people through all sorts of difficulties, given like the limitation of our senses and things like that. You know?
Okay, so on page 836, Socrates really tries to pin Callicles down. You know, you're really saying that if a person is to be the kind of person he should be, he shouldn't restrain his appetites, but let them become as large as possible, and then should procure their fulfillment from some source or other, and that this is excellence. Yes, that's what I'm saying. So then Socrates takes a slightly different tack. So then those who have no need of anything are wrongly said to be happy. Callicles says, yes, for in that case, stones and corpses would be happiest. And then Socrates goes into a bit of a mythical path and talks about what he has heard from wise men in the past. And without sort of dwelling on the specifics here, because there's a lot that we could dwell on. Let's just get to the main point of the imagery here. This imagery that Socrates has heard from somebody else is a kind of a metaphor for this kind of person that Callicles is talking about. Someone who has insatiable desires is a bit like, or his soul rather, is a bit like a leaky jar, which, because it's never going to be filled, because as soon as you put water in it, it runs out at the bottom. And it's a really powerful image, actually, I think, because I remember reading this when I first read the Gorgias years ago, and I thought, wow, you know, that's an interesting way of conceptualizing a person. And, you know, we can kind of make it more specific, I think, in our time when we think of somebody maybe who's addicted to, say, alcohol, gambling, drugs. If you give somebody who's addicted to something like that money, well, it will just go on their addiction. It literally is like putting resources into something bottomless. So I think it's actually quite an effective image in that sense.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I like how the jar is etymologically related to the word persuadable. So the fool has an especially persuadable appetite, i.e. a leaky jar. Yeah,
and I actually thought that it actually occurred to me today that if we're translating the persuader as the influencer, now the etymology of the word influence from the Latin, influo, means flowing in. It's kind of like reproduces the imagery of the things flowing into the jar. So we can preserve our translation and Socrates' image. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? So Socrates finishes by saying, well, do I persuade you at all? So, you know, we've got this idea of persuading. And are you changing your mind to believe that those who are orderly are happier than those who are undisciplined? But Callicles is not convinced. And then Socrates kind of elaborates the image in saying that the different jars are filled up with different things. Now, someone who's got proper jars that are properly sealed, if he's filled up his jars, then he can relax. But someone whose jars are, whose containers are rotten, has to keep on filling them. So it's the same point, but with a slightly different emphasis. Now, Callicles' position is that, well, the man who's filled himself up and has got the secure container is not going to have any pleasure anymore. And so it's kind of like living as a stone, having no sensation, no pleasure. But his position is pleasure consists in having as much as possible flow in.
Yeah. And just quickly too, before we get too far ahead, I think there's a subtle dig at Callicles too in that story, because where he asks Callicles if he can persuade him, he's talking about persuasion and its relationship to appetite and foolishness and things like that. But he's using a different kind of persuasion. He's using rational persuasion. And Callicles admits that he will not be persuaded by reason, which means that another part of the soul, his appetite, rules him, basically. So he's saying, and the quote you gave is that I want to persuade you to change your mind about it if I can, to choose the orderly life, the life that is adequate to and satisfied with its circumstances at any given time, instead of the insatiable, undisciplined life. So you got this contrast between Socrates, the man whose life is governed by reason and can be persuaded only by philosophy, by reason, and Callicles, on the other hand, whose life is governed by this jar etymology, by the persuasiveness of this oscillating back and forwardness of the leaky jar that needs to constantly be filled every night. It's really clever, I think, that he just walks straight into it, basically.
I think one thing that I think of here is like, so this is not a complete critique of Socrates, because obviously like, we've used this like a dialogue. When he's presenting these two options, like it's not a true dichotomy. Like, there's more options there that could exist in between. And like, for example, like when he's describing the jars, and I think of like what I like in life, like of that, like, oh, you know, like you got the one that's leaky rot and the other one that's sort of filled, and that's it, it's done. Like I think of myself, like I like the fact that I look back at myself like 5 years ago, 4 years ago, or a year ago, and I'll be like, oh, no, I've changed this thing and I've improved here, there, and like that's been constant without my throughout my life. And I having that as part of life, like it doesn't seem, I don't know, maybe it does mean that I am sort of agreeing with the having like the good jar is the good thing to have there. But like there is something about having that reflection, like this idea of just getting to a point where you're stale and like 10 years later you sort of believe the same things that you've always believed. Like I think about like, you know, you sort of meet some people who are older and it's like they're still got the mentality of a 15-year-old, particularly males, of like just the same level of humor. And it's not like there's anything inherently wrong with it, but it's just kind of like, oh, you haven't like grown or changed. Like there's nothing wrong with that at that point. But like when you're 50, 60, 70 years old, it's a bit like, okay, come on. Like there's no reflection.
Yeah, it's a bit sad.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably about the word I would use. But yeah, it was just something I was thinking about.
But you wouldn't, for example, want to be the guy whose idea of the good was pleasure, in the sense that Callicles is presenting it, that he only gets satisfaction from constantly gratifying his desire for pleasure over and over and over and over. But obviously Callicles got this idea that he's competent enough to be able to continue to do that for forever or for however long. But I mean, when you think about it like that, it's obviously not a great way to live your life.
Yeah. No, I do definitely probably have leanings there, because like you could say like that's a view of like a disciplined life, I guess, in some way, to have that like self-reflection is what I was talking about. So it does lead.
But I think
the irony.
I think, oh, sorry, Shannon, I think Socrates has covered that base already, because remember he says about Callicles that he has knowledge, he has goodwill, and he has frankness of speech. So I think what Socrates is telling us, Callicles has covered those bases. He has that potential.
Mhm.
It's just that in this area of his ideas about power and pleasures, he's on the wrong track. So I don't think Socrates is suggesting that you should not change at all after a certain point, or not grow in virtue, or develop at all. I think it's specifically with this reference to power over self and desires that he's referring to it.
And it's important, I think, to notice too that both of the paths that they're talking about require a lot of effort. It's not like Callicles is doing something that's easy to do. His lifestyle requires him to constantly be filling these, attending to his pleasures and seeking out ways to gratify them. And that's a discipline that takes a lot of effort. And so we often think that the Socratic kind of, or the Stoic method, is hard work, but so is the other life. So you don't get out of the effort, you know what I mean? Either way, you have to choose a technique, a procedure, and you follow that procedure, and that procedure leads you to the good, whatever you think that good is, either pleasure or virtue in this case.
Do you think Socrates might have been a bit ironic there when he says Callicles he has goodwill and all the rest?
No, I think he's dead serious. I think Callicles is serious where he says he's got a soft spot for Socrates. I think there's goodwill on both sides. I think they're just both. I think they respect each other. They've just got, even though Callicles is putting Socrates down, I think there is some kind of warmth there, but just they have a radically different approach to the best way to live.
And he gets a bit grumpy.
Yes, it's a bit grumpy.
It's just some of the things he says, like, oh, just calm your farm. It's okay. We'll be all right.
So halfway down that page, Socrates insists that if there's a lot going into these jars, and there's going to be a lot of coming out of them, and there's going to be big holes. And so Callicles agrees to that. And so Socrates says, well, that's the life of a stone curlew. That's weirdly specific, isn't it? But curlews are a wading bird, so they're always sticking their long beaks into the shallow water and finding things, instead of that of a corpse or a stone. Tell me, do you say there's such a thing as hunger and eating when one's hungry? Yes, obviously. And so then Socrates goes on to make a reductio ad absurdum of Callicles' emphasis on pleasures, because he says, well, is scratching an itch one of those things where you're gratifying yourself? And Callicles says that's absolute nonsense, because that's one of those low rent kind of pleasures, scratching an itch, that he doesn't think measures up. And so Socrates actually insists on pressing the point on the next page. What about scratching your head? And what about the life of a catamite? And that's a very antique term, but essentially it's a male prostitute. And so Socrates keeps pressing forward, well, you know, what about those kind of pleasures? And Callicles is a bit put off. Aren't you ashamed, Socrates, to bring our discussion to such matters?
And if you think about how you would modernize that, like in a play or a drama, it's pretty crass what Socrates does, because he's having a kind of serious discussion. He's like, how would you like to get fucked in the ass? You know, he just goes like that. And the dude's like, what are you talking about, bro? You know, it's kind of like that.
It's kind of funny too, because it just reflects a lot of like online debates I see, where like you just give the most like crass example you can. My favorite one was someone doing a debate, and their point was that was on God, and they're like, oh, so does God know what it's like to be fucked in the butt? And the guy was like, what, how dare you? Was that because, you know, he's sort of that like macho-y hetero type of guy. It's so good. It's just such it's not a high intellectual quality, but it can be funny.
Well, you know, the precedent is here in Plato. So yes.
But in a slight defense of Socrates, like there is, I think like this is a reasonable move to make in an argument. It's to go, okay, well, like you're making this argument here, but I think this has results that you're going to reject really strongly. So I want to like have something which sort of like has that punch to make you go, oh wait, okay, like sort of like back off on that position. So I don't think he's been too unreasonable with the point that he's trying to push there.
No, I think
No,
it's
not at
completely
all.
reasonable. And it also, again, points up Callicles', for want of a better word, sort of aristocratic preferences, essentially, because he doesn't really want to address these crass kind of pleasures. He wants to keep it on a much nicer level. But if he isn't going to be frank about what his values actually are, well, what is the reason for preferring one kind of pleasure over another? So then we get into quite a complex argument. And I think Socrates, towards the end of that page, which is page 838, is picking up on the fact, if we remember earlier, Callicles actually appealed to courage, because one of the things that he obviously approves in the better people, the better men, is courage and also knowledge and wisdom. And so Socrates asked him to say whether bravery is distinct from knowledge. And it's obviously distinct from pleasure. That's at the end of that page, 838. Of course, says Callicles. Okay, so Socrates has got Callicles to admit, while saying that pleasant and good are the same, but knowledge and bravery are different from both from each other and from what's good. So he's making some distinctions there. Now, and again, this gets quite complex. And if I understood it, I think what Socrates is kind of getting at here over the next couple of pages is trying to demonstrate that people experience good things and bad things by turns. And if they experience two different states at the same time, such as, I don't know, maybe having brown hair and brown eyes, then those things are not the things that are good or bad. They're kind of indifferent kind of things. So we find on page 840, being hungry is painful, but eating when you're hungry is pleasant, and so is drinking when you're thirsty. So then Socrates concludes that it's possible for a person when they've been in pain to feel enjoyment. But feeling enjoyment isn't the same thing as doing well.
Yeah, because Callicles has already agreed that that a person who is doing well can't be doing badly simultaneously. So
Yeah.
that's the ground there.
And so Callicles actually pretends not to understand what Socrates is getting at here. But here finally Gorgias comes back into the debate and says, don't do that, Callicles. Answer him, Socrates, for our benefit too, so that the discussion may be carried through.
But that's a really important point. Why does Gorgias jump in? I know Long makes a comment about it in the book on Epictetus. I can't remember the details of the comment, but he was basically trying to show that Gorgias is sort of taking up the elenchus, you know, starting to take on the dialectic and engaging in the Socratic style. It's I don't know, it's an interesting idea because obviously it's doing something in the story. Why does Gorgias get?
Maybe he feels that Callicles isn't is maybe taking things down a. Well, actually, Callicles doesn't even have the initiative at the moment. So, yeah, I'm not really sure, I guess. But because Gorgias is kind of the authority here, Callicles agrees.
Isn't he trying to make a point that like Gorgias has like enough intellectual capacity, right? Like he's a worthy combatant of Socrates to engage in the dialectic, but it's just because he's morally corrupt that he will, or be beaten by Socrates because he's a kind of relativist or a nihilist.
Well,
I'm not sure, but I'll look up the quote I was talking about and I'll post it in a Facebook.
Okay, so Callicles and Socrates keep going. So Socrates says, so answer where you left off and tell me whether each of us stops feeling pleasure at the same time as he stops being thirsty. Callicles thinks, yep. Or when we stop being hungry or stop having other appetites. But that doesn't mean that the person who stops feeling a pain or a pleasure stops having good things and bad things at the same time. And Callicles agrees to that. And so Socrates says, because it turns out that good things are not the same as pleasant ones, and bad things are not the same as painful ones. For pleasant and painful things come to a stop simultaneously, whereas good things and bad ones do not, because they're in fact different things. So that's a little bit obscure to me, I have to say. Does anyone have any kind of insights on that bit?
Isn't he really just saying that you can have pleasure and you can have pain simultaneously? For example, you have the pain of hunger, so you eat. But while you're eating and experiencing the pain, you also experience the pleasure of eating. So but he's already made the account that he's agreed upon, and this is where the whole thing seems to kind of sit on this ground, that if a person is doing well, they can't be doing badly at the same time. So what he's really saying is, pleasure and pain aren't good fits for good and bad because they happen simultaneously at exactly the same time. They can go away together and they can come together, but good and bad things can't. That's basically what he's saying. Good and bad things are the opposite of each other. And he gives an example about the disease of the eye, right? He says, your eye can have a disease and you can cure it, but unlike the pleasure and pain kind of comparison, you can't cure the disease in the eye and suddenly lose the health of the eye simultaneously, because they're mutually, they don't, those opposites, good and bad, can't be in the same place at the same time. They one exists where the other is not, basically.
Yeah.
So he's really pointing out in this nitpicking kind of way that pleasure and pain don't act like that, so they can't possibly be good or bad. I mean, do you guys agree with that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
agree with that. I was going to say exactly the same thing. So I'll just be doubling up on yeah, you've made the point well.
So Socrates kind of brings another slightly different point forward towards the end of page 841 there, in suggesting that, well, foolish people feel enjoyment. So, and also intelligent people feel pain or enjoyment. And then he develops this idea to suggest whether cowards or brave men feel more relieved in battle if the enemy retreats, or more enjoyment, more pain on the advance of the enemy and more enjoyment on the retreat of the enemy. And it's a little bit unclear where he's going there, but he says, so don't foolish men and intelligent ones and cowardly men and brave ones feel enjoyment and pain to pretty much the same degree? Or do cowardly men feel them more than brave ones?
There's just a slight step before it, I think, though, where the argument starts. He says, you can call a man good because of the presence of good things in him, just as you can call him good looking because of the presence of good looks. So that's how he sets this one up. And then he says, Have you seen a foolish child feel enjoyment? Yes. Or a foolish man? Yes. Have you seen an intelligent man feel pain or enjoyment? Yes. So both the fool and intelligent experience the same. Even cowards experience enjoyment when the enemy retreats, and maybe more so even than the brave man. So he's setting up this idea that if pleasure is good and pain is bad, bad people are just as good people. Sorry to interrupt. I just thought the first bit kind of sets it up.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I have to say that I find this page a little bit, overstrained perhaps. But anyway.
I saw what he was doing is a series of arguments. So the first one was the opposite things. They all relate, but the first one is about how pleasure and pain exist together, but good and bad are opposites, so they can't appear together at the same moment. And then there's a second argument which comes in. So it's like a series of arguments. The second argument is about that having good means that there's the presence of good in you. And then he goes on about how the good people and the bad people, the fool and the intelligent people, that sort of stuff, both equally experience pleasure and pain. And therefore that muddies the water about pleasure and pain being good and bad, because both good and bad people experience these things equally. And then a third argument he brings in, I think, or is that it? But that's what he seems to be doing. It's like a punch, punch, punch. It's a bit of a combo. Yeah, that's how I saw it.
Yeah, although I do have a bit of sympathy for Callicles here, because Socrates does seem to be kind of, he superficially he's getting agreement every step of the way, but sort of perhaps a little bit, he is maybe pushing his own kind of interpretation a bit. And, it's probably, you could probably spend a lot more time studying these arguments. And I haven't gone back to the Greek in detail, but yeah, I do find it a little bit, what's the word? Yeah, I suppose I've got a little bit of reservations about some of these arguments, I guess, without being really clear about what I'm thinking Socrates is trying to do.
Yeah, definitely. I have sympathies. It's like with getting agreement with Callicles and then going and that Socrates is trying to.
But you can see why he's doing it, because the next thing that happens, right, is he's putting this layer on, and then another layer, and then another layer, and another layer, and finally Callicles submits and says, okay, right, some pleasures are good and some are bad. That's what happens. Socrates could have just said that, but he doesn't. He forces Callicles, just from sheer pressure of his arguments, to admit that, it's wrong.
Well, I think that actually comes on the next page, 844. So we've got this idea, and now on top of the idea of the good, we've got this idea of the beneficial as well. And the beneficial pleasures are the ones that produce something good, while the bad ones are those that produce something bad. And so that brings us, I guess, back to this whole idea that we saw in the early part of the dialogue about why people do things. That they do X as an intermediate in order to gain the purpose of Y. So this brings us back to eating and drinking. So if you're eating nutritious food, then that's in order to produce health in the body.
Isn't that point here where, sorry, just before we get past it, they'll always go, Socrates saying, the good ones, the beneficial ones, and the bad ones, the harmful ones. And then it's like Kelsey's like, yep, And the beneficial ones are the ones that produce something good, while the bad ones are the ones that produce something bad. Doesn't that mean that that argument's like circular? Like, I guess like all definitions fall into that, but it sort of feels a little odd that it's like using good in the definition of beneficial.
Yeah, and you know why? This started again, and this in the first section, it started when they talked about admirable things, if you remember. And this section starts again when Socrates introduces the admirable things again. So there must be some connection to admirable things and this connection with good and beneficial. Because he says, they say it's an admirable thing to speak of and examine what's admirable twice and even thrice. So he's going on and on about admirable things. And I think this brings in, because it's soon after this that Socrates starts to tease out the difference between what he's interested in and what other people are interested in. He's interested in, a life of reason and philosophy, of following reason's own ends, not the ends of merely gratifying pleasures and those sort of sensuous whims. He talks about that. I kind of lost my train of thought, but yeah, admirable things, and that's right, because if he's choosing that worldview, right, towards reason's ends, part of that, this is what I think is going on, and I think Foucault's right. I know a lot of people will disagree with this, but I think Socrates' worldview is one that's inherently therapeutic, so that's why the beneficial comes in, and it's always there when he's talking about the good. So what is good for Socrates is the kind of life that is good for your soul and improves you and makes you excellent and makes you kind of perfects you or rounds you off or fulfills you in some way that's natural and healthy and fulfilling and teleological, baby.
Yeah, that's right. And towards the end of that page, it brings us back to this whole question about, let's recall what I was actually saying to Polus and Gorgias, that there are some practices concern themselves with nothing more than pleasure, practices that are ignorant about what's better and worse, while there are other practices that do know what's good and what's bad. And he placed the knack, or not the craft, of pastry baking among those who are concerned with pleasure, and the medical craft among those concerned with what's good. And to your point, actually, about whether Socrates is serious about saying the good things about Callicles, that he has knowledge and goodwill and freedom of speech. Here Socrates invokes Zeus, the god of friendship. So I think he's coming in friendship. I think he's serious about that. He's urging Callicles to say what he really thinks, because their discussion is about nothing less than the right way to live.
And if you think about how he sets up the crafts, which he's already done before, but in contrast to knacks, it sounds just like the way that the Stoics formulate the rational faculty basically later on, because he says something like medicine, so he's talking about a craft, is capable of investigating both the nature of the object it serves and the cause of the thing it does, and is able to give an account of each of these. And this is literally what knacks can't do. Knacks only seek to persuade the people to listen to you, or to satisfy your own particular gratification for pleasure and power, basically. So what he's talking about is that these things, these crafts, which are all good for the soul, which are beneficial to the soul, have this inherently, deeply kind of extraordinarily, well, they're rational. They're rational through and through and through. They're what we would call science, or episteme, right? But you have to be careful here not to say something like he says, it is able to give an account of it, each of these things, but it doesn't say something like it's able to make hypotheses and then test them. You know, that wouldn't come until much, much later, as we know. But we've got the same kind of thinking, in a sense, going on. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, I guess so. And I haven't got this section of the Greek up, so I'm not sure what the Greek word that is translated here as account, whether it's logos or not. So I might examine that and report back. But yeah, then towards the end of the page, again, this idea without any consideration of what's better or worse. So consideration is a process of thought and deliberation. So yes, it's that idea of account. So again, so Callicles even goes along with that. Now, I found this confusing, where at the top of 846, where Socrates says, now, is this the case with one soul only and not with two or many? So I was like, what? What do you mean, Socrates?
Well, I know the answer.
Do you? Okay, go ahead.
Because much earlier on, Gorgias admitted that oratory couldn't teach groups of people. He said that right at the beginning. He said basically that the best an orator could do was just convince the people to do what you tell them to do. But what Socrates is actually getting at is something like, I'll just read out what I wrote. He connects rational procedures for knowing, not merely with gratifying pleasure, but for the improvement, the benefit, the excellence of the self, and as a method for improving groups as well, which is what Gorgias has admitted oratory can't do. So he's saying his interest in living the best kind of life and using reason to find out what that is something that you can show groups of people how to do, so you can improve the life of the city basically.
But I must have missed that where Gorgias said he wasn't able to teach groups, because I thought he implied that he certainly could.
No, early on he said that, and then it led into a bit of a back and forward where he was like saying something like, well, then if you're going to teach one person, like a student, do they already know it? Or do you have to teach it? Remember, there's that sequence that goes back and forward. And then he says finally, well, then I guess I'd have to teach that guy. And he's like, yeah, but you have to admit that's a lot of effort. And surely you wouldn't be able to do that with a group of people, like the people you're talking to. And Gorgias basically admits that, like, no, you can't teach.
Because
he doesn't have
the time. That's right. Yes, you're right.
Yes. So this is the difference between oratory again and Socrates' method, is one can benefit the group, the whole, everybody, whereas the other one can't, possibly. It only convinces people, persuades people.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, Claudia, thanks. So then we get into a discussion of different pursuits like lyre playing at competitions, training choruses. So these were all kind of things that were done as part of Athenian society. And what was the point of that? Were they some kind of gratification for the crowd, or were they with a view to improving the lives of the audience or the character of the audience? And with the particular cases that are brought forward, well, obviously no, there was no sort of improvement. And I thought it was quite funny where this guy Meles, he didn't even bring gratification because he brought such pain with his singing to the people. So that was quite funny.
One point of contention with this, obviously, I think a lot of people would have trouble with this, is you could argue that, say, contemporary dance or art or something like that, people would say, well, it contributes to the culture, you know, that's its greater purpose. Whereas Socrates clearly is missing that point. He's saying things like flute playing and that are just there to satisfy the senses. It's a waste of time, basically. But we could easily say, you know, we spend a lot of time in our culture saying that the arts are really important because they do something other than just stimulate senses. They establish culture and traditions and things like that.
But it's also like there's like cinema, like movies. There's a language within cinema, of like what's going on. It's not like we approach it as tabula rasa. Like we have like this built up understanding of like the way the story is talking and like what people we should agree with and disagree with. So, but I'm kind of surprised that doesn't like that Socrates doesn't see that as existing in his time, because wasn't that they had like the satires and stuff like that, didn't they? Like that to me like seems like that's kind of like it's not
But
just pleasure. Like there is something that it's like digging at.
he mentions that. He says, what about the plays, doesn't he? He actually brings that up. And he basically says, well, they're just there to satisfy the audience. I mean, I can agree in some senses, like you watch people who are watching Married at First Sight or something like that. Like, fair enough. That's never going to contribute to anything, right? Unless I'm missing something. Maybe I'm missing something. But then there are other things that people do, like maybe watching David Attenborough reporting on the lives of ants or something. Maybe that's really useful, you know what I mean? Like they are obviously worlds apart. One's entertainment, the other one's entertaining, but maybe it also gets kids interested in the natural environment and changes their perspective of the world, for example. I think his argument is a bit black and white.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like there's sort of like a weaving which can occur where you have like something that sort of has like a David Attenborough thing where there is definitely like a pleasure you can get from it. Like you like just like these like magnificent sceneries and sweeping shots as like the music swells and all that sort of thing. But there is also like something else you're getting out of it where like from that appreciation of to use that word again, nature, you sort of then can appreciate like the conservation of it or like the value in keeping it of like how those things are connected. So yeah, I agree. Like it is odd that it's sort of treated so black and white.
But he uses myth when like he realizes that like Callicles is the dialectic's not working on him, and he says, oh, well, here's a myth about the people when they reincarnate, right? And so he's got all the other myths like the myth of and all that kind of stuff, right? So Plato acknowledges the fact that like for the bronze-souled people, they're too dumb to that the dialectic's not going to work on them. So we need some myths because that's if they can't know the truth directly, the only way, like the second best is for them to act on these principles just because of these silly stories that we've made up. If that's the second best, we'll just have to go with that. So why he doesn't think like, well, we can use the flattery or the pandering of music and choruses to morally instruct people that aren't like enough of a gold soul to understand these things themselves. That kind of didn't. I thought that was a bit weird as well. Them to be so hard on tragedy and music, like he's so anti-art. Like just thinks all of art is just frivolous entertainment, pleasure seeking.
Yeah, I think
he's also.
I think he's just deliberately actually being a bit countercultural. I think because I think most Athenians would think that their great tragedy festivals and so on, which were closely linked to religious observances, were in fact did have a sort of a moral effect on people's lives. So I think he's, and again, yeah, I'm not quite sure why, but I think he's deliberately kind of being a bit provocative here, I would say. I don't know, I'm just guessing.
It sounds like that, but it does give you the feeling in the context of what he's talking about that if everyone's got these leaky pots that they're walking around with, they're all fools and they're all uninitiated, or the bulk of people are in this case. Well, these things that merely gratify the senses, like cosmetics and muffin making or whatever, and also plays and flute playing and things like that, they're just going to be tools in which they get further and further distracted, and led further and further away from a life of meaning, always kind of mired in gratifying the senses. And like you're saying, Ashley, like he might use mythology at times, but it's probably because they don't have a psychology. If he was a modern psychologist, he'd probably say something like, flute playing's really bad, and so are these dramas, because all they do is stimulate the serotonin in the brain, which causes a kind of addiction, and then the people are addicted to listening to flute playing. And if they don't get any flute playing, they're going to get depressed, and they're going to end up on SSRIs, and eventually they're going to have to get, like, you know, electric shock therapy. So we should ban all the flute players. And we already know that that Plato in the Republic, right, is wants to get rid of the poets and things like that. I think he has an argument along similar lines, that they mislead people from thinking about what's actually important, and instead lead them into these lives of frivolous entertainment, I guess.
And you see also in the symposium, like, Aristophanes is an idiot, and then he makes what's the other guy, Agathon, who won the prize, and he makes him out to be a bit of a midwit as well, and he sort of implies that, like, you know, the tragedy, like, there's a lot of those tragedies are kind of just pandering, like, they're just kind of these formulaic things to please the crowd, and all these tragic poets are just trying to please the crowd. But, like, he does, you know, there's no dialogue called the Euripides, is it? You know, like, he sort of kind of cherry picks there a little bit. Like, maybe most of these poets were just dumb, you know, like they must have had their equivalent of Married at First Sight, but he sort of throws the baby out with the bathwater.
For sure. All right. Well, look. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, let's kind of move to wrap it up this evening, because time's marching on. But just to the point that Callicles, and so Socrates says that, well, there's a bit of a disagreement about whether these great orators, such as Themistocles, Pericles, whether they made the Athenians better or worse by their public speaking. And Callicles maintains that, in fact, these were good men. So Socrates says, okay, well, let's look at whether a good man won't just say things at random, but he will give his product, in this case, public speaking, shape, structure. Any craft is all about bringing a structure to bear. So making a ship is about having a structure, having a framework. Even, you know, physical trainers and doctors are concerned with the organization and structure of the body. And so Socrates concludes that these crafts, these useful skills, are all about bringing order and organization. And I think we see where we're going to be going here. It's about the soul having a good organization and order as well, which seems like a good point to kind of come to an end tonight, because we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, that was really good. It's definitely a lot to dig into and explore.
What an amazingly complex dialogue. We've been at it for 4 hours. We haven't finished it. It's
and
great.
We've kind of really only scratched the surface, I think. But thank you, everybody. It's been great. So thanks for being part of Gorgias too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Judith. That's wonderful. You lead it so well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Okay, see you, everyone.
See you. Bye.